The Kelthari warship hung in orbit above Kepler 22b like a silver thorn against the stars. Its hull was built from materials that had never once been touched by fire, and its crew had never needed to be. Admiral Vasare stood at the observation deck, 6 arms folded behind his back in the posture of someone deeply unimpressed. He was reviewing the dossier on the new human delegation that had just docked in Base 7, and the file was, by any reasonable measure, alarming. Humans. Carbon-based. Endothermic. Atmospheric oxygen breathers. Average surface temperature. 37 degrees Celsius maintained internally, year-round, without mechanical assistance. Admiral Vasare had read that line 4 times during the flight briefing and still could not make himself believe it. His own body maintained a careful 12 degrees. Anything above 20 felt like standing in a cremation furnace. The Kelthari had once attempted to colonize a planet with an average surface temperature of 19 degrees and had abandoned the project inside of a decade. The docking bay doors opened with a pressurized hiss. Vasare straightened his uniform and prepared for first contact. 3 humans walked through. He had reviewed photographs, of course, but photographs failed to capture the sheer radiative presence of them. His thermal sensors, never designed as weapons, practically screamed. The tallest of the 3 was a woman, Captain Sarah Vance, according to her file, and she was wearing what human military doctrine apparently called a field jacket. A heavy fabric layer over another fabric layer, on top of a body that already ran at 37 degrees. His attaché, a junior diplomat named Teal Voss, leaned close and whispered through his thermal mask. "Sir, their body signatures are registering as a localized heat anomaly. The environmental sensors in the bay have flagged them." "I can see that," Vasare replied quietly. He raised one of his 6 arms in formal Kelthari greeting. "Captain Vance, welcome aboard the Sovereign of Distances. I am Admiral Vasare, commanding officer of the 4th Deep Range Fleet. We are honored by your delegation." Captain Vance returned the gesture as best a 2-armed creature could, which was honestly a decent approximation. She had a face that was hard to read, something the dossier had warned him about, and her eyes were doing that constant, quiet scanning thing that humans apparently did when they were paying attention. "Admiral, the honor is mutual. We're looking forward to the summit." Vasare nodded. "We have prepared chambers for your delegation on level 9. I must inform you, in the interest of full diplomatic transparency, that our standard ship temperature is maintained at 11 degrees Celsius throughout. We understand this presents a challenge for your biology, and our engineers have done their utmost to raise the temperature in the delegation suite to," he checked his notes, 18 degrees. "We hope this will be sufficient." There was a pause. The 3 humans exchanged a look that Vasare could not quite decode. Captain Vance offered a small, polite smile. "That's very considerate of you, Admiral. 18 degrees is fine." "Fine." Vasare turned the word over in his mind. His chief medical officer had spent 3 days modeling what 18 degrees would do to a Kelthari who accidentally entered the delegation suite without thermal protection. The answer had involved the phrase, irreversible cellular collapse. The humans thought it was fine. The summit was scheduled to begin the following morning, standard galactic clock. It concerned the contested resource lanes along the Calvaroon corridor, a strip of interstellar space rich in quantum-stable minerals that both the Kelthari Compact and the new Human Colonial Authority were eyeing with considerable interest. The talks were expected to be tense. What Vasare had not expected was that the tension would begin before anyone had said a diplomatic word. It started with the conference room. The summit chamber sat precisely at the midpoint between the Kelthari hull sections and the delegation suites. A neutral temperature compromise, his engineers had decided, set at 15 degrees. Vasare arrived early, as was custom, and found the 3 human delegates already seated, reviewing their tablets. They were dressed in their full diplomatic attire. Captain Vance still had her jacket on. The other 2 humans, a Dr. Amara Osei and a young aide named Torres, looked perfectly comfortable. One of them was drinking something hot from a sealed container. The steam was fogging his thermal sensors. Vasare took his seat. His 4 senior staff arranged themselves beside him. He noticed, with professional detachment, that 2 of them had quietly elevated the settings on their personal thermal regulators. The 3rd was pretending not to shiver. The 4th, Lieutenant Nas, who had once completed a cold survival challenge on an ice moon, looked almost relaxed, which at least preserved some dignity. The first hour of talks went reasonably well. Both sides were experienced diplomats, and experience mostly meant knowing when to listen. They traded opening statements, reviewed boundary charts, debated the legal framework under which joint extraction rights might be established. Vasare was careful. He was precise. He said nothing that could not be taken back, nothing that could not be reframed, nothing that committed the compact to a position before he understood the human one. Then the temperature alarm went off. A soft chime, nothing dramatic. His aide touched his wrist screen and leaned in. "Sir, the environmental systems on this deck have logged an anomaly. Local ambient temperature has risen by 1.4 degrees since the humans entered the room." Vasare did not look up from his notes. "I am aware. It's still rising, sir." He looked up then. Captain Vance was watching him with those quiet, scanning eyes. She had both hands flat on the table. She was not sweating. She was not flushed. She was, as far as Vasare could determine, at complete physiological rest, and she was raising the ambient temperature of an 1,100-ton deep space warship through sheer metabolic existence. The Kelthari concept of a living weapon had always been theoretical. He was no longer sure it was. He cleared his throat, a borrowed human gesture he had picked up from years of diplomatic study and never quite managed to stop doing. "Shall we take a short recess before we address resource partitioning?" "Of course," Vance said pleasantly. "Though I should mention, my team and I are happy to continue if your side is comfortable." 3 of his staff were now visibly uncomfortable. His aide was sweating, which Kelthari physiology almost never permitted above the surface of active volcanic zones. Vasare squared his shoulders, noted the irony of that phrase with a private, exhausted amusement, and called the recess anyway. Walking back to his command suite, he passed the environmental monitor station. The technician on duty gave him a look that was equal parts alarm and professional restraint. "Sir, the thermal readings from conference level 4. "Yes," Vasare said. "I know." He paused. "Adjust the cooling forecast for tomorrow's session, and brief the medical team." He thought for a moment. Quietly, the technician nodded. Vasare continued down the hall, already reorganizing tomorrow's strategy in his mind. He had negotiated with species that breathed methane, species that communicated through electrical discharge, species that experienced time in nonlinear intervals. He had always adapted. He had always found the edge, the lever, the point of advantage that cooler heads, his speciality, allowed him to see. He had not yet found it with the humans. But the summit had barely begun, and already, something in the back of his ancient, carefully temperature-regulated mind was telling him that the real negotiation had not started in the conference room at all. It had started the moment those 3 warm-blooded anomalies walked through the docking bay doors, and they had not even noticed they were playing. The second day of the summit began with a piece of intelligence that Admiral Vasare had not asked for and did not entirely know what to do with. Lieutenant Nas, the Cold Moon survivor, his most reliable low-temperature operative, had been monitoring the delegation suite overnight as standard security protocol. His report, delivered over a secured channel at the beginning of the ship's morning cycle, contained the following observation. The humans had slept with their climate unit turned off. Vasare read the line again, then a third time. Then he called Nas directly. "Confirm," he said. "Confirmed, Admiral." The delegation suite climate system was manually disabled at 2100 hours ship time. Internal suite temperature dropped to the ambient hull temperature of 11 degrees by 2340. The humans did not re-engage the system. They slept through it. Nas paused. Dr. Osei appeared to open a window vent at one point. "There are no window vents on level 9. She opened an atmospheric intake panel and pointed a small personal fan at herself. "Sir. For airflow, I believe." Vasare sat with that for a long moment. 11 degrees. The humans had spent the night at 11 degrees, in a warship hull that was never designed for biological habitability at standard settings, and one of them had decided the problem was not enough airflow. He ended the call, stood at his porthole, and watched the slow distant spiral of the Varun Nebula for exactly 3 minutes while he reorganized his thinking. The morning session was scheduled for the tactical conference room on level 6, a larger space, with better projection systems for the corridor maps. It was also, as engineers had helpfully noted, 2 degrees warmer than level 4 due to its proximity to the ship's reactor shielding. Vossare had accepted this with a composure he did not fully feel. The humans arrived precisely on time. Captain Vance was again wearing the jacket. Vossare had begun to think of the jacket as a kind of personal affront. Not intended, not aggressive, just a quiet, constant reminder that the cold that threatened his staff was, to her, a light cardigan occasion. Dr. Osei had brought a second hot drink. Torres, the aide, was carrying a physical notebook, which Vossare found both charming and baffling. Paper, in deep space, on a ship whose hull was rated for near-absolute vacuum on the outer plating. They settled into the resource partitioning discussion. The human position had sharpened overnight. Captain Vance presented a counter-proposal on extraction rights that was cleverer than Vossare had anticipated. It preserved the appearance of equal access while concentrating operational control at human-administered relay stations. It was, he recognized with genuine respect, a well-constructed trap. The kind of offer that looked generous until you drew it on a map. He spent 40 minutes carefully not accepting it while appearing to consider it deeply, which was a specific diplomatic skill that the Kelthari Compact had been refining for 300 years. What he had not planned for was the heating conduit. At the 1100 mark of the session, the ship's automated environmental management rotated its thermal cycle, a routine process that temporarily diverted heat from the reactor shielding through the Level 6 corridor network. It lasted approximately 8 minutes. During those 8 minutes, the tactical conference room experienced a localized temperature spike of 6 degrees, peaking at 19 Celsius. For Vossare's team, it was suffocating. His senior strategist, Commander Velron, made an involuntary sound that was going to be described in no official report ever written. Tealvoss, the junior diplomat, quietly elevated his thermal mask to its maximum setting and kept talking, which Vossare respected as a performance of extraordinary professional will. Two of the human-facing analysts began breathing through their cooling filters in slow, studied intervals, which was the Kelthari equivalent of a cold shower and almost as undignified. The humans noticed none of this. Captain Vance was drawing a revised boundary line on the projection with a light pen, talking without pausing, apparently energized by the temperature rise in the way that cold-blooded species responded to sunlight. Dr. Osei had taken her jacket off. She'd been wearing one under the first one, apparently, and was nodding along while annotating her tablet. Torres had refilled his hot drink. "We think this partitioning framework," Vance said, drawing a clean arc through the center of the contested corridor, "gives both parties operational clarity while preserving the joint oversight mechanism. Does that align with the Compact's initial concerns, Admiral?" Vossare, who had been quietly calculating the exact number of minutes until the thermal cycle completed, brought his full attention back to the map. "It is a thoughtful proposal, Captain. I would require time to review the operational specifics with my team." "Of course." She set down the light pen. "Should we break for lunch?" The thermal cycle completed 4 minutes later. The room dropped back to 13 degrees. Velron exhaled in a way that was technically a sigh, but functionally a survival response. Vossare straightened his uniform and led the recess with every gram of composed authority he possessed, which was considerable. In the corridor outside, walking towards the officer briefing room, Nas fell into step beside him. "Sir, I've been reviewing the human physiological data from our ambient sensors. The temperature spike in level 6. They showed zero thermoregulatory stress response. I observed. I've been cross-referencing it with historical records." Nas lowered his voice, though the corridor was empty. "Admiral, humans evolved on a planet that experiences temperature swings of up to 60 degrees Celsius between seasons. Some of their inhabited regions regularly reach 50 degrees in summer. They have cities, on land, where it reaches 50 degrees. Vossare walked in silence for a moment. "And their cold tolerance?" "Historical record indicates survival in sub-zero environments for extended periods with minimal equipment. There are documented accounts of humans voluntarily immersing themselves in near-freezing water for recreation." Nas paused again, as though still processing this himself. "They call it wild swimming, sir." Vossare stopped walking. He turned to look at Nas. Nas, who had completed the Varun Ice Moon Challenge on record speed, who wore his cold endurance like a badge, looked genuinely unsettled. "They do it for fun," Nas confirmed quietly. "On purpose." Vossare resumed walking. He needed to think, and thinking, for the Kelthari, happened best in motion. The pieces were arranging themselves in a way he didn't entirely like. The humans had not chosen this ship as the neutral ground. That had been the compact suggestion, offered as a gesture of good faith and also, Vasare now recognized, as a psychological play. Their own territory, their temperature, their ground rules, quietly embedded in the choice of venue. A classic move, the kind his own Academy text described in the chapter on environmental leverage. He had used it first, and it hadn't worked. Because the humans, on a ship held at 11 degrees, in a tactical conference room that had briefly spiked to 19, after sleeping through a night at ambient hull temperature, the humans were fine. They were, by every measurable physiological indicator, absolutely fine. Captain Vance had looked, if anything, slightly more alert after the heat spike. Torres had been taking better notes. Dr. Osei had removed a jacket layer in what Vasare was now realizing had been not discomfort, but something close to relief. He entered the briefing room, took his seat, and looked at his senior staff, all of whom showed the quiet, careful discomfort of people who had spent 2 days working hard not to show discomfort. New approach for the afternoon session, he said. We abandon environmental strategy entirely. They are not susceptible. He let that land. We negotiate on merit. There was a short silence. Velron said, with impressive self-control, Understood, sir. We also, Vasare added, raise our personal thermal regulator settings. I am not asking anyone to suffer for optics. He looked at his aide, whose face had been doing quiet things all morning that a more self-important commander would have pretended not to notice. We are negotiating a resource corridor, not staging an endurance trial. Leave the Ice Moon theatrics for the next Cold Moon challenge, Nas. Nas nodded, already reaching for his regulator. The room temperature in the briefing space was set at 14. It felt, suddenly, entirely reasonable. Vasare reviewed his tactical notes and began preparing a counteroffer that would require no environmental assistance whatsoever, only precision, patience, and 3 centuries of diplomatic institutional memory. He was going to need all of it. Because whatever edge he had imagined he held at the start of this summit, he had just watched it melt quietly away in a room where the humans had not even noticed it existed. The crisis arrived on the 3rd day, as crises often do, without announcement, during a meal. The Kelthari Compact had arranged a formal diplomatic dinner for the evening of day 2, held in the warship's ceremonial hall on level 2, which was the most climatically demanding space on the entire vessel. The hall's temperature was set at a fixed 9 degrees, a cultural and architectural tradition among the Kelthari, who associated lower temperatures with prestige, formality, and the cold dignity of old blood. Vasare had hosted 19 diplomatic dinners in this hall. No guest had ever complained. No guest had previously been a warm-blooded endotherm, with an internal core temperature higher than the room's ambient setting by 28 degrees. He had issued a diplomatic advisory the previous afternoon. The dinner was formal, but informal compliance was acceptable. Guests were permitted to dress according to their species' environmental requirements. He admitted it sincerely. What he had not anticipated was how the human interpretation of that advisory would read to his own staff. The humans arrived dressed for their own version of a formal occasion. Captain Vance wore a dark, structured jacket over a high-collared shirt. Dr. Osei wore layered fabrics in deep colors. Torres had a tie on, which Vasare had needed to look up and still found confusing as a concept. They were, in short, warmly dressed humans at a cold dinner. Entirely reasonable. His staff, all in ceremonial thin fabric Kelthari formal wear, designed for prestige rather than warmth, had spent the first 20 minutes of the dinner visibly regretting their life choices. The food was the second surprise. The Kelthari kitchen had prepared a full traditional menu: crystalline mineral broths, cold-pressed seed arrangements, chilled plant extracts in ascending order of bitterness, all served at between 4 and 7 degrees. Vasare watched Captain Vance eat the chilled mineral broth with the careful, expressionless courtesy of someone who had clearly been briefed on not making faces at alien food and had taken that briefing very seriously. Dr. Osei tried the seed arrangement with what appeared to be genuine interest. Torres ate everything placed in front of him with the focused determination of someone eating for the mission, and Vasare found that, of all the human qualities he had observed in 3 days, that one was perhaps the most understandable. The conversation over dinner was good. Removed from the pressure of the formal sessions, the humans were not warmer, they were always warm. That was rather the issue, but more relaxed. Dr. Ose asked intelligent questions about Kelthari stellar navigation that Vossaray's chief astronomer answered with quiet delight. Torres somehow got into a philosophical discussion with Lieutenant Nas about what cold meant as an experiential rather than a thermal phenomenon. Vance and Vossaray talked, carefully and honestly, about what each side actually needed from the Varan corridor rather than what each side was formally requesting. It was, Vossaray thought, the best 2 hours of the entire summit. And then the hull's cooling system exceeded its operational parameters. It was a technical failure, not sabotage. His engineers confirmed this within the hour. A cascade fault in the tertiary cooling manifold had caused the ceremonial hull to drop from 9 degrees to 4 degrees in under 12 minutes. For the Kelthari, this was uncomfortable but survivable. Cold, yes, sharper than preferred, but within the tolerance of a species that had evolved in deep space habitats. For Vossaray's 2 human-facing junior attachés who had been stationed near the outer wall venting array, it was apparently a problem. Both had begun showing signs of mild hypothermia by the time the engineering team isolated the fault. Both recovered quickly once moved to a warmer deck. They were fine. The humans, at the table, were fine. That was the part Vossaray kept returning to. They were fine. The temperature had dropped 23 degrees below their internal body temperature in under 12 minutes, during a formal dinner, and the 3 human delegates had noticed. He had seen them notice small adjustments in posture, a moment's pause in the conversation, and then continued talking. Continued eating. Torres had wrapped his hands around his cup and kept going with whatever point he was making to Nas about the phenomenology of cold, which Vossaray later decided was either irony or the most human thing he had ever witnessed. He called a recess, had the hull temperature restored, offered apologies. Captain Vance accepted them graciously and said it was not a problem. He believed her, and that was the strangest part. It genuinely hadn't been. The moment that changed everything happened the following morning. Day 3. Final session. The resource partitioning terms had narrowed to one remaining point of disagreement: the location of the joint oversight station, which both sides wanted positioned closer to their own operational infrastructure. It was the kind of impasse that could go on for weeks. Both sides knew it. Both sides were measuring the other's patience. They had been in the tactical conference room for 4 hours. The session had been technically excellent and humanly exhausting. Vossaray had deployed every instrument in his considerable diplomatic repertoire. The humans had matched him, point for point, with a flexibility of approach that was simultaneously admirable and maddening. The room temperature was a negotiated 16 degrees, a concession from both sides that neither side had commented on, which was itself a small diplomatic achievement. Then the ship's proximity alert chimed. Not an emergency. The long-range sensors had detected a Varun-class stellar flare in progress approximately 0.8 light hours from their position. The automated systems responded instantly, rerouting power to radiation shielding and, as a consequence, temporarily suspending all non-essential environmental regulation on the occupied decks. Standard protocol. The engineering team's estimate for full restoration was 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, with no climate system running, the conference room temperature began to climb. The level 6 deck sat directly above the reactor shielding and 2 secondary heat exchangers. Without active cooling, the ambient temperature rose steadily. 4 degrees in the first 3 minutes. 6 degrees by minute 5. By minute 8, the room had reached 24 degrees Celsius. For Vossaray's team, it was the thermal equivalent of a crisis. Commander Velron had gone very still in the way that Kelthari did when they were prioritizing core function over peripheral response. Teal'Vos had stopped talking entirely and was breathing in measured intervals. 2 analysts had quietly removed themselves to the corridor. Nas, the Ice Moon veteran, the cold challenge record holder, the man who swam in freezing water for sport and called it training, was visibly struggling, his face doing things that no amount of professional composure was going to fully conceal. Vossaray himself felt it like pressure, like gravity increasing. The Kelthari body at elevated temperatures did not sweat. It signaled distress through a different mechanism, a cooling reflex that redirected blood flow to extremities in a last-ditch attempt to radiate heat. All 6 of his hands had gone very slightly cold. he was aware of, posed and his voice leveled through sheer institutional will, because 300 years of compact diplomatic tradition demanded it, and he was not going to be the Admiral who broke the chain. He was in the middle of formulating a sentence about the oversight station location when Captain Vance did something that stopped every Kelthari in the room. She reached up, unzipped her jacket, and took it off. It was a small motion, economical. She folded the jacket over the back of her chair and rolled up her sleeves to the elbow in 2 quick, practiced movements. And then she picked up her light pen and returned her attention to the corridor map as if nothing had happened. As if the room, which was currently 24 degrees and climbing, had simply become comfortable. As if she had been waiting, patiently, for the environment to reach a point where a layer could finally come off. As if this temperature, this heat, this level of warmth that was making Kelthari fleet officers quietly disintegrate, was where she was most at ease. The room was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Vossare was certain of this because he counted them. Then Nas made a very small sound. It was not a word. It was something between a breath and an admission, and it contained, in Vossare's professional assessment, the complete collapse of every psychological advantage the Kelthari Compact had imagined it held in this negotiation. Vossare made a decision in those 2 counted seconds. It was not a diplomatic decision, exactly. It preceded language, preceded strategy, lived somewhere below the level of policy in a place where instinct and pattern recognition fused. He had spent 3 days watching the humans be unaffected by everything his ship could passively do to them. And in that moment, watching Captain Vance roll up her sleeves in 24-degree air with the ease of someone finally finding the right sweater, something in him stopped trying to find an angle and simply accepted what was in front of him. These people were not performing resilience. They were not being strategically stoic. They were not enduring. They were comfortable. The cold had been a minor inconvenience. The heat was a relief. 3 days aboard a ship designed to be uninhabitable for their biology, and they were fine. More than fine. They had apparently slept better than his own crew. He picked up his light pen. "Captain Vance," he said, and his voice was entirely level, which he was quietly proud of. "I have a revised proposal for the oversight station." She looked up. The pen was already in her hand. "I'm listening." A jointly administered station, positioned at the geometric midpoint of the contested corridor. Equal operational access, dual command authority, staffed by mixed crews on rotating cycles. Neither party holds positional advantage. Both parties hold mutual accountability. He drew the point on the map. It removes the argument over location entirely by making the location irrelevant to either side's operational sovereignty. There was a pause. Dr. Osei stopped annotating. Torres looked up from his notebook. Vance was looking at the map with the expression of someone running rapid calculations and arriving, one by one, at the same answer each time. "That's a significant concession on station positioning," she said. "It is," Vossare agreed. "It is also, I believe, the only framework that will hold for longer than one administrative cycle. A station that one party controls will be resented by the other. A station neither party controls fully is one both parties have reason to protect." He set down the pen. "I would rather have a partner with a genuine stake than a subordinate with a grievance." Another pause. Then Vance set down her own pen and leaned back slightly in her chair. A human posture that he had learned, over 3 days of close observation, meant she was done negotiating and had reached a position. "We can work with that," she said. "We'll need the legal framework revised to reflect dual command authority, and we want the staffing rotation agreed before signing, not after." "Agreed," Vossare said. "Both conditions are reasonable." The climate system came back online at that moment. A quiet hum. The return of cool air through the overhead ducts. The room temperature began to drop. Across the table, Velron exhaled slowly and Teal'vos quietly unclenched both hands from the edge of the table. Nas, who had been sitting with the rigid stillness of someone refusing to show how much they needed a cold shower, allowed himself one brief, private eye close of relief. Captain Vance reached for her jacket. She picked it up, shook it out, and put it back on. Unhurried, unself-conscious, and returned to her tablet to begin drafting the framework amendments. She hadn't noticed the Kelthari team's relief. Or perhaps she had noticed and had the grace not to acknowledge it, which Vossare decided he preferred to believe. Either way, it was done. The climate had returned. The deal was taking shape. The jacket was back on. The next 6 hours were the most productive of the entire summit. With the core impasse resolved, the remaining details fell into place with the kind of momentum that good negotiations build when both sides are finally pulling in the same direction. Staffing rotations, extraction quotas, arbitration protocols, communication frequencies. Each item went on the table, was examined, was adjusted, was agreed. Dr. Osei turned out to have a detailed knowledge of mineral extraction logistics that surprised everyone, including Vasaray's own technical advisors, and the resulting conversation between her and Velron, who had emerged from his temperature-induced paralysis as a genuinely formidable technical mind, produced a quota framework that was sharper than anything either side's original teams had drafted. Torres, it emerged, was not just an aide. He was a legal specialist, and the revised framework he produced for the dual command authority structure was clean, precise, and, Vasaray's legal team confirmed after a 40-minute review, actually closed 2 loopholes that the original compact position had left open without anyone noticing. Vasaray made a note to check human diplomatic team compositions more carefully in future briefings. He had been reading Torres as support staff. He had been wrong. By ship's evening, they had a draft accord, not a final one, that would require review by the Compact's High Council and the Human Colonial Authority's Senate Committee, which was a process measured in weeks, not hours. But a draft accord that both sides were prepared to recommend, to advocate for, and to stake their reputations on. That was rarer than people outside the profession imagined. Vasaray had been in negotiations that produced technically complete agreements that neither side actually wanted to defend. This was not that. This was something both teams had built together, in a room that had been 4 different temperatures in 3 days, and it was solid. The signing ceremony of the draft, pending ratification, was held in the ship's ceremonial hall, now restored to a diplomatically negotiated 12 degrees. Vasaray had asked, through back channels, whether the humans had any temperature preferences for the ceremony. The response, relayed through Torres, had been, "Whatever works for your team, Admiral." We're flexible. He had kept the message. He was going to have it framed. Not as a joke. As a reminder, for future planning purposes, of a variable he intended never to underestimate again. After the signing, as the delegation moved toward the formal reception, Vasaray found himself walking beside Captain Vance in the corridor. They were both, he noticed, moving at the same pace, neither leading, neither following. It felt appropriate. "Admiral," she said, without preamble, "can I ask you something off the record?" "You may ask," he said, which was the diplomatic way of saying yes without guaranteeing an answer. The temperature management across the ship this week, the spikes, the cold nights, the dinner hall incident, she glanced at him sideways. Was any of that intentional? He considered his answer for precisely the amount of time it took them to pass 2 corridor sections. The initial temperature settings, he said carefully, reflected the Compact's standard shipboard conditions. Some of the subsequent variations were environmental systems operating within expected parameters. He paused. Some were not. She nodded slowly. Not surprised. Not offended. Processing, in that quiet, scanning way of hers. "Fair enough," she said. "For what it's worth, my team was briefed on Kelthari thermal strategy before we boarded. We'd read the case studies from the Teal-Masserin conference." She allowed a small pause of her own. "We were comfortable." Vasaray stopped walking. So did she. They stood in the corridor for a moment, 2 beings from 2 very different biologies, in a hallway that was 12 degrees and perfectly tolerable for one of them and actively pleasant for neither, looking at each other with the particular mutual recognition of people who had just conducted an extremely complicated game of chess and had come out, against expectation, at a draw they both respected. "You knew," he said. "We were prepared," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." He found, to his mild surprise, that he smiled, a borrowed human expression he had never successfully deployed before, which made this either a diplomatic breakthrough or a medical incident. "The Compact will be sending a ratification delegation to Earth in 6 weeks, he said. "I am told the average surface temperature in your capital city at that time of year is," he checked his memory, 31 degrees. "June in DC, Vance said. "Yeah, it's warm. My delegation will manage," Vasaray said. He said it with the particular firmness of someone committing to a thing they were not entirely certain of, but fully intended to see through. We are adaptable. She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. A real one, not the diplomatic approximation. Admiral, I believe you. She started walking again. Though I'd pack an extra jacket. He fell into step beside her. Noted. He thought for a moment. We will pack several. The reception was warm. Literally, a compromise at 15 degrees, which the Kelthry staff found pleasant, and the humans found slightly chilly, and everyone was professional enough not to mention. There was food that both sides could eat without incident, which was an achievement that deserved its own citation in the mission report. Nas and Torres ended up in a corner, apparently continuing their conversation from the previous evening, now apparently debating whether cold was a sensation or a concept, and Vasare decided to let them continue because it was keeping Nas distracted from the temperature and keeping Torres from writing notes on things that didn't yet need to be notes. Dr. Ose found him near the end of the evening, holding a warm drink she had produced from her own kit, and apparently carrying with the comfort of someone who had learned not to rely on ambient hospitality. Dr. Ose, he said. Admiral. She glanced around the room. I wanted to say, this was a good summit. I know the start was rocky, but we got somewhere real. We did, he agreed. I appreciate your team's patience with our conditions. She laughed, a brief, genuine sound. Admiral, with respect, your ship was lovely. Cold, yes, but lovely. She tilted her head. Humans spent 100,000 years living outside in whatever the planet threw at us. We adapt. It's sort of what we do. He thought of the sleeping humans in a suite at 11 degrees. He thought of the jacket going on, coming off, going back on. He thought of Torres eating crystalline mineral broth without a single visible reaction. He thought of what Nas had said, 100,000 years of open sky endurance, folded into 3 people in. Yes, Vasare said, with the careful sincerity of someone updating a fundamental assumption. I am beginning to understand that. The delegation departed the following morning. The docking bay doors opened, the shuttle cleared the hull, and Vasare stood at the observation deck and watched it go. A small, warm, stubbornly alive vessel slipping out into the dark between stars. He had already begun drafting the debrief for the High Council. The key strategic assessment, which he suspected would be studied for some time, was simple. Environmental advantage is not an advantage against a species for whom no environment is unlivable. Do not attempt thermal leverage on humans. It will not work. They will remove their jackets and keep negotiating. His chief of staff appeared beside him. Sir, the DC delegation prep list. Do you have thermal suit requirements for the team? Vasare looked out at the stars. Full thermal suits. Secondary cooling reserves. Also, he paused, choosing the word carefully, appropriate outer layers. For the variation. He turned from the window. And brief everyone on the temperature. He walked toward the door. 31 degrees, he added, mostly to himself. We will manage. He was already certain they would. He was also, and this was new, this was something the humans had given him without knowing it, genuinely curious about what managing would feel like, what it would take, how far the adaptation could go. It was, he supposed, something like the beginning of respect. Not admiration exactly, not quite wonder. Something cooler than wonder and warmer than strategy. Something that required no thermal adjustment, no environmental compromise, no borrowed expression borrowed from alien faces. Something that was simply, plainly, recognizably mutual. The stars were very old. The corridor between them was new. And somewhere between 9 degrees and 31, 2 species had found a place to stand.